The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and damp canvas, and Captain Halvorsen had already decided the woman at the back of the room did not belong. She was small for the role, her uniform pressed too neatly, her hands folded in her lap like a student waiting to be called on. He glanced at her file again, then at the three men beside her, broader, louder, the kind of operators who looked like the recruiting posters everyone expected. "We're evaluating for the Overwatch slot," he said, tapping the satellite image projected on the wall, a sprawl of rooftops, alleys, and a narrow market square in a simulated urban scenario. "Anyone see anything worth flagging before we move on?" The men leaned forward, pointing at the obvious choke points, the high windows, the suspicious van. The woman said nothing. She only tilted her head, studied the image for a long moment, then quietly raised one finger. "Sir, the laundry on the third-floor balcony, Building 4. It's been hanging there in every reference photo from the past 6 days. Same shirts, same order, no rotation. Someone's using it as a static visual marker, not drying clothes." The room went still. Halvorsen looked again and saw it. He cleared his throat, but did not speak. "So I want you to think about something before this story continues. Is the most dangerous strength in any room sometimes the quietest one? Tell me in the comments what you believe." Her name was Specialist Mara Voss, though within the year the radio would know her only as Ghost Raven. A call sign chosen not for drama, but for the way ravens watch a field for hours before they ever decide to land. She had grown up in a small mountain town in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of place where winters were long and silences were longer. And she had learned early that the world rewarded people who could sit still long enough to understand it. Her father had been a forester, a man who could read the age of a tree by the texture of its bark and the direction of a storm by the way the deer moved at dawn. Her mother had been a librarian, a woman who taught her that listening was not the same as waiting to speak. Between the two of them, Mara had absorbed a quiet philosophy that would later define her career. That observation was an act of respect, and patience was a form of intelligence the world tended to undervalue. She was not drawn to the military out of anger or family tradition or the need to prove anything. She enlisted because she had watched a documentary about search and rescue operations during a wildfire, and she had been struck by the calm voice of a spotter coordinating helicopter movements through smoke. That voice had not shouted. It had not panicked. It had simply known things, and because it knew things, people had lived. She wanted to be that voice someday, that steady frequency in someone else's worst hour. When she scored unusually high on the marksmanship qualifications during basic training, her drill instructor had assumed it was beginner's luck, the kind of fluke that flattered itself out within a week. But the second qualification was the same. So was the third. What set her apart was not raw talent, though she had that. It was the way she breathed. It was the way she did not flinch at boredom. It was the way she could lie in tall grass for 2 hours during a field exercise and not move so much as a shoulder, while around her, larger and louder soldiers fidgeted with their kit and complained about the heat. Her platoon sergeant had pulled her aside one humid evening near the end of basic and asked her, almost suspiciously, where she had learned to be still like that. She had thought about it for a moment, then answered honestly, "From watching things that didn't want to be seen, sir. Deer, owls, my father." He had nodded slowly, written something on a clipboard, and 3 weeks later her name appeared on a list she had not applied for. A list of candidates being considered for advanced precision marksmanship selection. She did not celebrate. She did not call home. She simply folded the paper, put it in her footlocker, and went for a long run in the rain, because somewhere underneath her quiet exterior, she understood that a door had opened, and she would have to walk through it carrying more responsibility than she had ever held before. Sniper school was not what civilians imagined. There were no dramatic montages of impossible shots, no swelling music, no instructors barking poetic threats. There was, instead, mathematics. There was wind, humidity, temperature, and the slow rotation of the earth itself. A phenomenon called the Coriolis effect that altered a bullet's path over long distances in ways that demanded humility from anyone who thought shooting was simply about aiming. There was the mil-dot reticle, the ranging formula, the constant mental arithmetic of distance and drop. There was the kestrel meter clipped to her vest, the dope book in her cargo pocket where she recorded every shot, every condition. Every correction and handwriting so small it looked like the margins of a monk's prayer book. Mara learned that a sniper was, before anything else, a scientist of the present moment. She learned breathing in a way she had never breathed before, the natural respiratory pause between exhale and inhale. That fragile half-second where the body went quiet and the crosshair finally stopped drifting. Her instructor, a wiry master sergeant named Doyle who had served 3 tours and rarely raised his voice, used to say that a good shot was 90% waiting and 10% permission. Permission from the wind. Permission from the target's behavior. Permission from the rules of engagement read aloud at every briefing. The shot itself, he said, was almost an afterthought, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence the shooter had been writing for hours. Camouflage was its own discipline, slower and stranger than she had expected. The ghillie suit she built herself over weeks, weaving local vegetation into burlap strips, dyeing it in coffee and tea to match regional palates. Lying in fields and creek beds while instructors walked within meters of her and failed to see her. She learned that movement betrayed more than color, that the human eye was wired to detect motion before form, and that the discipline of stillness was therefore the deepest camouflage of all. There were stalking exercises that lasted entire days, where she crawled across open ground at the speed of a minute hand, gaining 6 feet in an hour, her elbows raw, her uniform soaked through. Her mind floating in a meditative state she had only ever previously felt while sitting beside her father in a deer blind at dawn. The hardest lesson, though, was not about shooting. It was about not shooting. Doyle told the class one morning, in his flat, unceremonious voice, that the mark of a professional was the number of times they had a clean shot and chose to hold. He told them about operators who had watched a target for 30 hours and never pulled the trigger because the situation had not justified it, and how those operators had gone on to have long careers and quiet consciences. He told them that anyone who romanticized killing did not belong behind a long gun, and that the moment they began to enjoy the work was the moment they should hand in their rifle and find another job. Mara took notes that day in handwriting smaller than usual and underlined one sentence 3 times. Restraint is the weapon. Everything else is just the tool. She graduated near the top of her class, but she did not smile in the photograph. She looked, instead, like someone who had learned the weight of what she now carried. Her first assignment was to a reconnaissance company attached to a larger infantry battalion stationed at a forward base overseas, in a region of dust, olive trees, and old stone villages where the air smelled of diesel and bread. She arrived in the middle of a rotation, which meant the team she was joining had already formed its own rhythms, its own jokes, its own shorthand of glances and gestures, and she was the new variable they had not asked for. The team leader was a staff sergeant named Reyes, a compact man with a careful face who had served with the unit long enough to be skeptical of replacements. The spotter she was paired with, a corporal named Whitfield, had expected a different soldier, a man he had trained with at a previous post, and his disappointment was not hidden well. The other members of the squad were polite in the way soldiers are polite to outsiders, which is to say they were not unkind, but they were not yet family. Mara understood this. She did not try to charm them. She did not volunteer stories about herself at chow. She did not laugh too loudly at jokes she did not find funny. She simply did her job, cleaned her rifle every night with the same careful ritual, checked her gear twice before every patrol, and listened more than she spoke. Some of the men interpreted her quietness as arrogance, the silence of someone who thought she was too good for small talk. Others interpreted it as weakness, the silence of someone who was afraid to assert herself. Whitfield, frustrated by what he read as aloofness, complained to Reyes after their first joint exercise that she was hard to work with because she would not banter, would not share opinions, would not push back when he made a ranging call he was uncertain about. Reyes listened, then asked him a single question. Did she make the call correctly when it mattered? Whitfield admitted, reluctantly, that she had. Reyes nodded and said nothing more. There was an incident in the second week, small and easily forgotten by anyone who was not paying attention, that quietly began to shift the team's perception. During a routine patrol through a market road, the squad passed a parked sedan with a cracked windshield, and most of the men gave it only a glance. Mara, walking near the rear, slowed almost imperceptibly, then keyed her radio with a calm voice and said, "Sergeant, The sedan we just passed. The dust pattern on the hood is wrong. There's a clean rectangle near the wiper well, like something heavy was set down and removed within the last hour. Recommend we route the return through the alley instead. Reyes did not argue. He rerouted. Nothing happened that day, and they would never know with certainty whether her observation had mattered, but Reyes began watching her differently after that. The way a craftsman watches an apprentice who has just shown an unexpected instinct. He still did not fully understand her. None of them did. But he began to suspect that her silence was not absence. It was attention, focused so tightly that it left no air for chatter. And in their line of work, attention was the rarest currency in the world. The mission came down through channels late one evening. Briefed by a major from the battalion intelligence section in a small operations room lit by the blue glow of monitors and the yellow of a single overhead bulb. A local provincial official, a man whose cooperation had been instrumental in stabilizing the district, was scheduled to attend a community meeting at a schoolhouse on the edge of a village known to have mixed loyalties. There had been chatter, vague and unsourced, about a possible attempt against him during the gathering. The reconnaissance team's role was overwatch, nothing more, to occupy a concealed position before dawn, to observe the approaches to the schoolhouse, to identify any threats early enough that the security detail on the ground could intervene without escalation. The rules of engagement were strict, and the major repeated them twice. No shot was to be taken without positive identification of a hostile act in progress, without confirmation through the chain of command on the radio, and without absolute certainty about what lay beyond the target. The schoolhouse held children. The market beyond it held farmers. The margin for error was zero. Mara and Whitfield moved into position at 3 a.m, climbing through dry brush on a hillside roughly 600 meters from the schoolhouse. Settling into a hide they had constructed 2 nights earlier under the cover of a moonless sky. Reyes and the rest of the squad were dispersed at other observation points, their voices occasional and quiet on the team net. The hours passed slowly. The sun rose, pale at first, then strong, and the temperature began to climb. Mara lay behind her rifle, her cheek welded to the stock, her eye floating between the scope and the wider scan, her mind cataloging every movement on the approaches. A boy herding goats. 2 women carrying water, an old man on a bicycle, a delivery truck that paused too long at a corner and then moved on. She updated the team net every 10 minutes with a single sentence. No change. She drank water in small sips. She did not let her muscles lock. She breathed the way Doyle had taught her, slow and even, the way a person breathes who intends to be useful for many hours rather than impressive for one. By mid-morning, the official had arrived, and the meeting had begun. Around 11, Mara noticed a man on a rooftop 2 buildings east of the schoolhouse, carrying what looked at first glance like a long bundle of rolled fabric. Whitfield, watching through the spotting scope, started to call it in as a possible weapon. Mara held up one finger, the smallest gesture, and asked him to wait. She watched the man for 90 seconds. The bundle bent in the middle when he set it down. He unrolled it, and it was a length of carpet, which he began to beat with a stick, sending up clouds of dust. Mara keyed her radio. Possible threat negative. Civilian, household task, rooftop east of objective, continuing to monitor. Reyes acknowledged. The team breathed, and Mara kept watching, because the day was not over, and the mark of her work was that nothing would be the mark of her work if she did it well. The threat, when it finally appeared, did not arrive the way films would have shown it. There was no screaming, no sudden burst of fire, no obvious villain. There was instead, at 12 minutes past noon, a small white car that pulled into a lane behind the schoolhouse and parked at an angle that blocked the rear pedestrian gate. The driver got out, walked away, and did not return. Mara watched the car for 4 full minutes through her scope before she said anything on the radio, because she had learned in training that the first instinct of an inexperienced shooter was to report what they thought they saw, and the first instinct of a professional was to report only what they could verify. She noted the angle of the car. She noted the absence of the driver. She noted that the lane behind the schoolhouse was the route by which the official's protection detail had planned to extract him in the event of an emergency. She keyed the radio with the same calm voice she had used all morning. Ghost Raven to Reyes. White sedan, rear lane, parked obstructing extraction route. Driver departed northwest on foot, did not return. Recommend the security detail be advised and that the extraction route be reconsidered. I do not have positive identification of a threat, but the geometry is wrong. Reyes relayed the observation to the security detail on the ground, who quietly repositioned a vehicle to provide an alternate egress route, and who dispatched 2 men to inspect the sedan from a safe distance. While that was happening, Mara continued her scan, refusing to fixate on the car, because Doyle had taught her that the obvious threat was often the decoy, and the real threat would always come from the direction no one was looking. At 12:19, she saw him. A man in a dust-colored jacket, moving with too much purpose along a goat path on the far hillside, a path that paralleled the schoolhouse at a range of roughly 400 meters. He was carrying something low against his leg, and the way he moved, head down, shoulders forward, no looking at the landscape, no looking at the goats that were not there, was the movement of a man going somewhere with a purpose he did not want anyone to read. She tracked him for 40 seconds. She measured his pace. She watched the way the object at his side swung, the weight of it, the length. She did not call it a weapon, because she could not yet see it clearly. She called it a person of interest, gave a precise grid reference, and asked the team net to confirm whether any friendly elements were operating on that hillside. The answer came back negative. Reyes asked her, quietly, what she recommended. She answered without hesitation. Recommend the security detail relocate the principal to the interior room of the schoolhouse and delay departure by 15 minutes while ground elements intercept and identify. I have eyes on. I do not have a clean engagement, and I am not requesting one. We can solve this without a shot. Reyes relayed. The official was moved. A patrol intercepted the man on the goat path. He was found to be carrying a rifle wrapped in cloth, and he surrendered without resistance when he realized he had been seen. No one fired. No one died. The team rotated off the position at dusk, and Mara unloaded her weapon without ever having chambered a round. That night, in the small plywood-walled room the squad used as a debrief space, Reyes laid out the day's events on the board with a black marker and a steady hand. He walked through the timeline minute by minute, the observations, the decisions, the relays, the outcome. When he reached the part about the man on the hillside, he paused, capped the marker, and turned to face the team. I want everyone to understand something, he said. Today, the most important thing that happened was something that didn't happen. A shot was not taken. A bystander was not killed. A village was not turned against us. And the reason for that was not luck. It was a soldier in a hide on a hillside who watched for 9 hours, who reported only what she could verify, and who knew the difference between a threat and a man beating a carpet. He looked at Mara, who was sitting in the back of the room with her hands folded the same way they had been folded in that very first briefing months ago. Specialist Voss, when you got here, I'll be honest, I didn't know what to make of you. Some of us thought you were aloof. Some of us thought you were unsure. I think today we all learned what you actually are. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Whitfield, who had spent weeks frustrated by her silences, walked over to her after the debrief and stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, searching for the right thing to say. He finally settled on something simple. I owe you an apology, Voss. I thought your quiet meant you weren't with us. I get it now. Your quiet is how you stay with us. I'll be a better spotter for you from here on. She nodded, and the smallest smile, almost too small to see, touched the corner of her mouth. The change in the team after that day was subtle, the way most real changes in military units are subtle. There was no grand speech, no swelling music, no sudden brotherhood. There was only the slow recalibration of trust. Soldiers began to ask her opinion before patrols, not because she demanded it, but because they had learned that her opinion was usually worth the silence it took to produce it. Reyes started routing patrol planning through her observation log, treating her dope book and her field notes like a piece of unit intelligence rather than a personal diary. The radio call that had once seemed strange, Ghost Raven, take the shot, became something the team understood differently than they had at the start. They understood that when she was given the authority to take a shot, the more important question was always whether she would choose not to, and that her judgment about when not to act was the thing that kept all of them, and the people they were sworn to protect, alive. She had not become louder. She had not become more like them. They had simply learned to listen the way she listened, and in doing so, They had become a better team than they had been before she arrived. Mara Voss served out the rest of that rotation and several more after it, and she eventually became an instructor herself, teaching young marksmen the same lessons Doyle had once taught her. In the same flat, unceremonious voice, in classrooms that smelled of cleaning solvent and old coffee. She told her students, again and again, that the rifle in their hands was the least important thing about them. The most important thing was the discipline in their minds, the patience in their bodies, and the responsibility in their hearts. She told them that anyone who wanted to be a sniper because they wanted to take shots had already disqualified themselves, and that the soldiers who lasted in the work were the ones who understood it as a form of guardianship rather than aggression. She told them that observation was an act of respect, that restraint was a form of strength, and that the highest honor in their craft was to spend a career protecting people who would never know their name, through decisions they would never see, in moments that would never make a headline. Her story is not the story most people expect when they hear the word sniper. There are no impossible shots in it. There are no slow-motion heroics. There is, instead, a quiet woman in a hide on a hillside, breathing slowly, watching carefully, choosing again and again to be useful rather than impressive. And maybe that is the deepest lesson her journey offers, the one worth carrying out of this story and into the rest of your day. The strongest people in any room are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who have learned to be still long enough to see clearly, disciplined enough to act only when they must, and humble enough to measure their success by the harm they prevented rather than the harm they caused. Her greatest weapon was never the rifle. It was the silence she had built her whole life inside, and the responsibility she carried within it.